Hello and welcome. My name is Jeremy Glover, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our latest Fenwick Elliott webinar. This month, we are turning our attention to the NEC Accepted Programmes. Our panel will look at how to avoid common disputes and the type of pitfalls that they see all too often, both up and down the contractual chain. And they'll explain how to ensure the accepted programme on your project is the useful project tool envisaged, and I think it's fair to say expected, by the NEC form. Joining us today is Scott Jardine, a chartered civil engineer with over 27 years experience, currently a senior managing director at Ankura, based in London. Recommended as a global leader by Who's Who Legal in 2022, Scott is praised for his pragmatic approach and high quality output, as well as his simple and clear response, all of which are key attributes for anyone dealing with programs. Scott is joined by two of my colleagues, partner Claire King, who's been at Fenwick Elliott for nearly 14 years now. She currently sits on the Adjudication Society Committee and is one of those heading up the research into adjudication that's being carried out in conjunction with King's College. Senior Associate Mark Pantry is a key member of our projects team. He has specialist knowledge across all contracts, being a founder member of the JCT Young Professionals Group. So before I hand over to them, just a reminder, you're all on mute, but please do send in any questions, and you should be able to find the slides on our website later in the week. A link we put on the chat during the webinar. But Claire, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. As Jeremy said, we're going to aim to provide a practical guide to NEC Accepted Programmes, both from a legal and also from a programming perspective during this webinar. We're going to look at, first of all, what is the purpose of an accepted programme and how does it fit into the NEC contract as a whole, taking into account the NEC ethos. Then how to set it up correctly, what does the contract provide for, the requirements for accepted programmes, any amendments to it, accepted programmes and how that you flow that down to any subcontractors, and Scott's going to provide some programming tips for setting it up correctly in the first place. Then we're going to look at how to keep it going, which we all know can be difficult in projects. And then what happens when the system breaks down, both during the job itself and also at the end. What are the common problems we see and our ideas for maybe how to tackle those, and solutions, both from a practical programming perspective and also from a legal perspective. So turning first, what is the purpose of an accepted programme? Now I know anyone working in the NEC world knows that it is a very different contract and it fundamentally requires a different mindset to work properly. And I just thought I'd very briefly refresh you memories on that, because the accepted programme is a very important part of that ethos and how the contract sets it up to succeed if you use it properly. So obviously the parties, we all know, are meant to act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. You've got collaborative working, which requires the early identification of problems and a proactive approach to addressing those problems. And the whole idea is issues are resolved as the works progress. CEs, for example, extension of time requests, are meant to be looked at as they occur and resolved as soon as possible, prospectively, not retrospectively. So you're not meant to have this final account process at the end of the job, although we all know that does happen all too frequently, unfortunately. So to encourage that proactive approach, the contract provides some very prescriptive procedures, including in relation to accepted programmes, which we're going to run through with you today, and also tries to use clear language, although I think some people would debate that. So how does the accepted programme fit in? Well, it's all about good project management. People want to know what they have to do and when. And the contract encourages that, and it sets down clear consequences if people don't abide by what is in the accepted programme. So some of the CEs, and I'll just list the sort of the most obvious: failure to allow access by the date shown in the accepted programme, the client does not provide something by the date in the accepted programme, the client or others do not work within the time shown in the accepted programme, and the data plan completion, the employer stops or the event stops the contractor completing by that time. Obviously, in order to get that CE, you need to have things in the accepted programme that you can use as a hook. So for contractors, it's a really strong incentive to make sure that you've got those key dates in that programme. If you've missed them and they're not in the accepted programme, then you've lost your chance for a CE potentially. If you've got a good accepted programme, it should allow an assessment of extensions of time without the need for a complex delay analysis and put Scott out of the job. Collaborative working and dispute avoidance is all about that and how to encourage it. So as I said, it's a tool for assessing compensation events, but it needs to be regularly updated to allow for that contemporaneous assessment, or it becomes too out of date. The contract itself uses the accepted programme current at the dividing date in order to carry out that assessment. So the dividing date is either the date of instruction, notification, certificate, or changing of the decision, or it's the date the CE was notified. And we do sometimes see amendments to that provision, and it's not necessarily a good idea because those are the logical dates for looking at the accepted programme. And it's also a real incentive to notify your CEs on time. So, don't fiddle around with the wording unless it's really necessary. So that's the wording for how you use the accepted programme on the dividing date. And I think Scott is going to look at that from a practical perspective a bit later. If there is no delay to completion when you input your CE, then the contractor's float within the programme will be used up. But if the delay does impact on the critical path, then the contractor will retain its terminal float, and we'll look at that again, how that works in practice rather than theory a bit later on. And then it's just worth noting that the NEC guidance note says that only operations which are not complete and which are affected by the compensation event are changed when you're looking at the impact of a CE. There are some carrots and sticks for encouraging people to set up their accepted programme and keep on top of it. Clause 50.5 is probably the biggest stick. I don't know how often people actually use this, but if there's no accepted programme provided from the contract data and you're meant to provide one, then 1/4 of the price for work done to date can be retained until you do get an accepted programme. And some people I've seen have suggested that you might continue that through the job, maybe less of a retention as an incentive to keep that going. It's quite a draconian thing to think about, but there is that stick in the contract, so don't forget about it. Also, and maybe even more importantly, you're going to lose control of the compensation event assessment process if you don't have an accepted programme, because the PM is required to assess all compensation events and use their assessment, not your programme. So it's in your own interest to have that accepted programme in place. So we're going to look at how to set it up correctly, because with all that theory in mind, all too often there is game playing on accepted programmes, and we look at how to try and stop some of the worst problems we see. So I'm going to hand over to Mark.
Thanks, Claire. Afternoon, everyone. Obviously, from what Claire's been talking about, the importance of the first accepted programme can't be understated. You've got to set it up correctly, and there's two ways that the NEC contract allows you to establish a first accepted programme. The first programme can be either identified in the contract data, and that's usually the tender programme that's been submitted by the contractor. So even more so than other accepted programmes, it's frequently out of date, that first accepted programme, by the time the contract's entered into and by the time that works start. If the tender programme is used and it's included in the contract data, then that accepted programme is the only time when the requirements of clause 31.2 don't apply. We'll go into more detail about what clause 31.2 requires, but that only applies where programmes are submitted for acceptance. If they're included in the contract data, then they don't necessarily, although it is obviously best practice, to comply with those requirements. If an accepted programme is included in the contract data, it's deemed to be accepted by the parties when the contract's entered into. The second way you can get your first accepted programme which is it must be submitted for acceptance within the period stated in the contract. And this is where we get to with what Claire was saying before about that there might be a period where money is withheld until an accepted program, a program for acceptance is provided and then accepted. This obviously increases the chance of there being no accepted program for a contract. Either the contractor doesn't submit one, in which case that money is withheld, or that first accepted program is never approved by the project manager. And you could get into a very odd scenario where you start works without an accepted program. Hopefully, as we've shown, that would be an issue for both the client and the contractor, and we'll go into ways later on to go and resolve it. There is only ever one accepted program. Previous accepted programs are superseded by the newest version. One question we get asked quite a lot is about the interrelationship between an activity schedule under options A or C and the accepted program. But they are separate documents, and they need to be separate documents, but they're frequently linked. If you look at clause 31(4) under option A, you've got to show each activity on the activity schedule relates to the detail in the program submitted for acceptance. In the guidance note, the NEC says that the accepted program and the activity schedule won't necessarily be identical, but they should be correlated. That correlation should be updated as throughout the works as they progress. And it's interesting, if you want to look at it in the NEC contract itself, it uses the term operation instead of activity to distinguish those two items. So on the next slide, we'll go into more detail. It set out the precise requirements of what is in the accepted program. But broadly, the accepted program is required to contain the items in 31.2. And those are generally dates. You know, that's what you kind of expect from a program. Some dates are known, some aren't, and some are planned. And some dates may not be within the contractor's control, so that there may be deadlines that the employer or others have to meet. Methods. This is the equipment and resource that will be used, but also the ordering and timing of that equipment as well. So, for example, if you need a hoist on site for a particular operation, going back through the program, placing the order for that hoist could be on the program as well. Provisions. Those are usually items which the contractor doesn't want to disclose as a matter of course. You know, his float, his time risk allowance, and so on. But they are sought as part of that wider NEC idea of transparency. And then the final broad heading is information, and that is the other information required by the contract, whether that's in the scope or through amendment. And what kind of amendments do we see frequently to the requirements? Well, you could see amendments to change the timings for submissions of accepted programs or programs for acceptance. You could make it more frequent if so required, although that obviously increases the administrative burden, or you could make it less frequent if you've got a particularly difficult project where you are relying on subcontractors submitting their accepted programs and building it from there. You could also have requirements about the particular type of programming software you require a contractor to use, and that could similarly be flowed down to subcontractors as well. You can also use it to link, if the NEC contract doesn't use provisional sums, but you can see amendments sometimes to include provisional sums in the NEC contract, and frequently that is linked to the accepted program, dates by which provisional sums have to be instructed or otherwise. So on this next slide, I've set out in full the particular requirements under clause 32.1. As I say, broadly broke down into those four broad areas: dates, methods, provisions, and information, and so on. I think the second to last, Scott, is going to go into more detail about what is needed for that statement on how the contractor plans to do the work. I would just watch out for that final bullet point there, which is a kind of wrap up and says anything else which the scope requires. It might not be a specific section in the scope which says this is what you require additionally. It might be hidden somewhere among the scope, an additional requirement for the accepted programme. And the process for accepting it or rejecting it, on the next slide, we've got a flowchart of showing how the process works. Previously in NEC 3, there was no deemed acceptance of programmes. NEC 4 has introduced that, albeit there's quite a few hurdles that a contractor has to jump through to make that. The project manager's got 2 weeks to accept or reject, and then the reasons for for rejecting are quite limited. The commentary is that 1 and 3 below, practicable or realistic planning. They often go hand in hand, and the project manager's got to act independently, obviously, when giving those opinions on whether or not a contractor's plans are practicable. I would just say as well that the plans is not defined. It's not just drawings. It probably goes further than wider method statements for the scheme. And set out here is a flowchart, hopefully, which will be helpful to show how a contractor submits its accepted programme and what happens if there is a rejection, an acceptance, or if there's silence. So if after 2 weeks there is no response, then the contractor again has to notify the project manager of its failure to accept or reject. After another week, there is deemed acceptance of that programme. So it can be up to 3 weeks. It could be longer to get an accepted programme deemed accepted. So I think I'll pass on to Scott.
Thank you, Mark. Oh, sorry, that was my fault. Yeah, thank you, Mark. What I'm going to talk to you now is some of the practicalities of what I've seen as being successful NEC contract programs. In my mind, one of the key elements of this is to really understand how the program is going to work for you as a project team. So yes, it's prepared by the contractor, but the intention is that it's a useful tool that everyone trusts, that the information in it is accurate, that it's being updated sort of diligently and transparently. So to help set that up, you have this statement of work, which, in other words, it's used by a lot of planners in a lot of jobs, but it's a sort of program narrative. So what you're trying to do here is to explain in words what you're showing in the activities in the program, and it should include your explanations, only at a summary level, of why you've got a particular sequence of works, what resources you're going to use, what equipment you're going to use. And that becomes very important later on in the project if there's changes, because if you've set out that this initial program is set up on the assumption that this sequence is going to be followed because of these requirements or these dependencies, then if that changes, you can revert back to the statement and say, that's how we originally planned it, things have changed, we now need to change the plan to show this. So by setting this all out transparently, it can be a real help, not only in initially getting the first program accepted, but it helps smooth the way for future programs when you need to revise them, because that thought process has been set out. Now, one of the sort of key parts of NEC is time risk allowance, which I'll go into a little bit more. But again, the statement of work should include an explanation of how you're dealing with that and how you've come to consider it. The usual things for time risk allowance are, for instance, doing earthworks in the winter, or activities that may be subject to wind interference. So if you're building a high structure and you've got cranes with limits on how strong the wind can be to lifting. All those sorts of things are very important to include as time risk allowance. And the narrative part of the package of the program is a key part for you to explain why it's there. And if you're the other side of the fence, if you're the project manager, it helps you to understand the contractor's thought process, enables you to challenge it a little bit more, to stress test it and become comfortable that what's being put in the program is appropriate. The descriptions of working calendars is an interesting one. There is a way of putting in time risk allowance into your program by using the calendars that sit in the software. So you might have a calendar that's dedicated to earthwork activities that shows that during the summer months you can work 12, 14 hours a day, very unlikely to be impacted by weather. So you might allow 1 or 2 days a month where you're impacted by rain. That same calendar can show in the winter that you're going to expect 50% weather disruption. You're going to have low levels of hours per day, 8 till 4, whatever you might be able to do. And by explaining that in this statement of work, you're not hiding the fact that if delays cause your earthworks to move into the winter, the activity duration will extend. And it's not because of any sleight of hand, it's because the risk for working in the winter has been included in the program, in the calendar, and it will naturally be shown in the program. But again, it just helps shortcut any arguments if you've explained that in the statement of work. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm pressing too many buttons, too eager. So what I've got here is a very simple Gantt chart just showing some of the key points that Mark touched on earlier. NEC, a couple of key dates that you need to include in your program. So you've obviously got the start date. It's not necessarily the case that site access will be the same as the project start. So include a site access date. And towards the end of the project, you've got 2 completion dates. One is the planned completion. So that's the date you're planning to finish the works. And the project completion is the date that you are you're contractually required to. So LDs will flow if you're not done by then. And in between those dates, I've just set out there sort of typical. The red bars are critical path. The green bars are activities with float in them. But they include activities where you might be waiting for information for others. You might be waiting for access to certain areas. You might be waiting for keep needing materials from the employer. And even some of the slightly less interesting areas of a project, the site office setup, you might include, or you probably should include, some activities for that, because it's showing you the whole, how you're going to do this project as a whole, not just the sort of the bare minimum of the activities. The time risk allowance, which I mentioned earlier, is specifically highlighted in the NEC contract, and it is actually very different to the float. Now, the float is found in all programs. In its simplest form, it's just a gap between the finish of one activity and its successor that it could be delayed slightly before it causes any critical delay to the end of the program. However, terminal float is something that the NEC has sort of specifically identified, and it's owned by the contractor because it's the period of time between when the contractor plans to finish the work and when it has to finish the work. And that in the NEC is a sort of known period, and it's termed terminal float. Time risk allowance, as I mentioned earlier, is to do with identifying and showing the risks that you are anticipating are on this project. I use the weather for earthworks as an example. That's a pretty typical one. And it can be shown in a number of ways. I've already explained the way of putting it into a working program, so working calendar, but you can show it as a block duration. So at the end of a particular activity, you might say, well, we're going to allow an extra 5 days time risk allowance there because that activity might be delayed due to delays in transportation, which are outside of our control. Or you can scatter it amongst the activity. Not my favorite, if I'm honest, because it's very difficult to keep control of. So you might have, you might just say within this activity duration, I've identified a couple of points of time risk. You can actually not show it at all. You can just have a slightly extended activity bar. Again, not my favorite, becomes absolutely ripe for argument about where the time risk allowance was and how you deal with it, or you can show it in the calendar, which then it adjusts or changes depending on whether it's a time of year related risk. But I think one of the important things is there, and I've shown it very simply, is to identify that time risk allowance and show how many days or weeks you've got in each time risk allowance category. In terms of float, free float, as I said, is effectively, it's in every program, and it's just the gap between activities that are not critical and activities that are critical. And terminal float is there in that bottom right hand side, which is the time between plan completion and project completion. So it, again, in there, just an example of where you might see time risk allowance in the program. My preference is to have it specifically identified as a separate activity or as a block duration, but there are numerous ways of doing that. And now I think I'm handing it back to Mark.
Thanks, Scott. I think that's really interesting, because I think in the industry, and I think I'm guilty of this as well, that float is just used for a catch-all for everything, including time risk allowance. So I think from future I'll be more specific. So once you've got your first accepted program and you need to revise it as the project continues, the specific contractual requirements for the contractor to revise its program, usually it's monthly, although it could be more frequently if needed. Again, if the monthly requirement to do an accepted program and submit it is too much, then you might want to consider amendments to increase that time period to give everyone a little bit more breathing room, particularly when you've got lots of subcontractors to manage and manage their accepted programs as well. So what have you got to show on each revised program? Well, you've got to show everything that you previously showed on the previous program for acceptance. By that I mean everything that's in clause 31.2. But you've also got to show these 3 additional bullet points on the slide here. So you've got to show progress on each operation and the effect that it has on the remaining work, and how delays are dealt with, and defects as well. So that could push back the planned completion date, and it is perfectly acceptable to have a program where the planned completion date is after the completion date. And then the final bullet point is actually quite a powerful tool for the contractor. It's anything else that the contractor wants to show. And a project manager should be aware of revisions. Programs are contractor-led, as we've said, but a contractor could, in dealing with delay, reduce periods for client activities. So if there was halfway through a program a client activity which was 2 days, and as a result of a delay, the contractor has proposed to reduce that to 1 day, in accepting the program, that would be accepted by the client. So a project manager needs to consider that period is reduced, that is a client activity, is that acceptable? Very briefly, just looking at subcontractors' accepted program, I think a common issue is subcontractors being relied on for information which feeds up into the main contract program. So when looking at those subcontract programs and the process in the subcontract for getting that, then you might want to consider changing around those timings, considering, as Claire mentioned before, about whether or not you need more of a stick than a carrot, retaining money, and you would need a specific contractual provision to do so until a subcontractor provides his program. I think, Scott, I'll pass back over to you on that.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. So what I'm going to do here is just to go through, hopefully fairly briefly, a sort of example of aspects of revising the program. As Mark mentioned, one of the important bits is getting accurate, updated progress to date. Now, hopefully that is within the contractor's scope of influence to understand exactly how progress is going on its bit of the works, but it's not unusual for there to be some miscommunication between subcontractors and the main contractor, or a supply issue where contractor might not be aware that a piece of equipment is delayed in transit. But it's really important to try and get that updated information as accurate as possible. And as part of the revision of the programs, you really do want to consider everything possible, because the whole aim is to, again, keep the trust in the program, make sure that everyone sees it as a reliable and genuine tool for the project to use. So people go to the program to see not only how progress is going and that things are on time, but looking forward, what do we need to do next? What's the next things we need to do as a project team to get this project delivered? And harping back to the planning statement, again, it's a favourite of mine. It gives you the opportunity, both sides, to properly understand the program update. Why have things changed? If you've changed the program, why has it changed since the last update? Explain perhaps how you've discovered that you need a different sequence of works in the future. And it's just transparently, again, explaining the reasons for any changes, the reasons for why the program now looks how it does. And a very important part is confronting the time risk allowance periods in the program. As the project moves on, your need for time risk allowance should reduce. So if you've broken down time risk allowance into separate elements of sections, so there will be a time risk allowance associated with foundations, for example. Once you're out of the foundations, that time risk allowance, you've either needed it and you've used it, or you didn't use it and you should release it. So I'm a great advocate for thinking carefully when you're setting up the time risk allowance so that you can release it as you go, saying, okay, actually earthworks went really well, we didn't have that 2 weeks of weather delay we expected, so I don't need that, and you release it from the program. Now, there is always a temptation to hold that in reserve, to say, well, I know I didn't need it for the weather, for the earthworks, but I might now need it at the end of the job. I mean, I would very strongly advise that you don't do that, because you should already have appropriate time risk allowance built in for the activities at the end of the job. And again, it just helps build trust between both sides that, okay, that risk didn't materialize, you no longer need it, it's released. But equally, you might have additional TRA needed. And the COVID-19 was an absolute great example for that. Every project, in pretty much in the world, suddenly now had a new risk on the risk register. COVID-19, what's that going to do? And the NEC projects I worked in, most of them did a good job in identifying that and trying to allocate time risk allowance into the future, using one or many of the revisions of the programs as the impacts of COVID were known more. But again, explanation, right, we've now got an extra 40 days of time risk due to COVID-19 on these activities, split over the next 10 months, say, in the planning statement will help to smooth that through. So again, very simple graphics just to show different scenarios. This one is an example. So the red dotted line down vertically down to sort of a third of the way across from the left of the program is your update date. So we're saying, right, as at the end of August 2019, here's an update to the program. In this instance, actually progress has gone pretty much to plan. There's been a little bit of delay to the structural design, but that's a non-critical activity. So whilst it's showing delay to those activities, you've got no impact on the end date, no impact on your plan completion. So that would be a fairly simple update. Next one is an update where you're perhaps showing critical delay. So in this instance, the processing unit fabrication has been delayed. You're showing there, this is an assumption that it's the contractor's issue. Yes, our fabrication is late, it is on the critical path, and we're showing a delay to the critical path. In this instance, you would show that it's got an impact on the planned completion. So that's the date that the contractor is planning to finish the works. But the project completion doesn't move because you haven't had an extension of time, and as a result, the terminal float reduces. So that's the sort of almost the last ditch catch-all risk allowance in the program, is this terminal float. So the contractor can say, right, we've got a problem here, planned completion slipping, so the terminal float will reduce between the planned completion and the contract completion. Of course, not all delays are going to be due to the contractor. So how do you deal with updating the program for compensation events? That's about a 3-hour session in its own right, so we're not going to go any very close to it. But the process is set out in the NEC. You know, you're supposed to pre-warn, so an early warning, there's a problem, something's going to happen. You put in your notice of compensation event, or there's a project manager's instruction if it's originated from a project manager, and then you produce a quotation. And it's the quotation that includes the assessment of the impact of the contractor, impact of the event on the program. And it is a prospective impact. So it does say in the contract that it's time impacts usually shown on programs by in progress and future activity. So it doesn't mention retrospective, it's saying you do it looking forward. And the dividing date that Claire touched on earlier is important. So that's the date where you update the program to the dividing date. So you bring in all the historical information up to that date, and then you assess the impacts going forward. If there's no accepted program, then the project manager does that assessment, which is obviously not an ideal situation. You know, the wheels are starting to come off the project, but that is the way that the impact's done if there's no accepted program. And here I've just, again, very simple example. Let's assume the dividing date was the end of June 2019. So that's the red dashed line running down the page. The event was a employer design change. There's been an assessment that will add 2 months to the processing unit design. That's put in a program. The accepted program is updated to the dividing date. Then this impact is shown, and this is showing a change to the revised planned completion date. But important to note, because it's a CE, if it's approved, then that whole time period shifts. So the terminal float is retained by the contractor, and how much the planned completion date changes is reflected in how much the project completion date's changed. So it moves in a sort of parallel motion across the page. A little bit more on the terminal float, different scenarios there, just to try and just sort of hammer home that terminal float is between planned completion and project completion, as shown on the top of those 4 slices there. The second one, if there's been contractor delay, then you can use the terminal float up without moving the project completion date. And in fact, you can't move the project completion date. So you get to a situation where, as Mark was saying earlier, you can show quite legitimately your planned completion way past the project completion date, because either you haven't had an extension of time granted, but it's most important that the program is believed, that it's trustworthy. So yes, you can fight over whose fault it was, but you're showing we're not going to finish until much later than we planned, and here's the impact and what we need to do as a team to hopefully pull that back. If you're ahead of planned progress, the terminal float increases because you're not moving the project completion date. And once you get approval of a compensation event, then the project completion date can move in line with the approval, the extension of time that's approved. I think it's back to Claire.
It is. So what could go wrong? Thought we'd sort of illustrate some of the common issues we see, and I see as a disputes practitioner. First thing, common issue is the delay to submission of the initial accepted programme, and that's a real issue because you're then constantly trying to catch up. And obviously, sometimes the delay is due to very good reasons. You want to make that programme as good as possible, but it causes real knock-on issues going forwards because you're constantly trying to update it and you're behind essentially right from the beginning. So if possible, try and avoid that. Another common programme issue is where subcontractors' programmes are not realistic and you've got constant issues trying to fit them into the main contractor's programme and then go them up. Sometimes that's because of subcontractor failures, quite often it is, but in other times, subcontractors are working from an incomplete picture and they're effectively shooting at an invisible target because you have not provided them enough information to allow them to give you a programme that works. So that's really something to think about. It's something that subcontractors, particularly M&E subcontractors, frequently complain about. They don't know what's happening and when from their perspective, so how can they program when they're constantly having to shift? Another problem is where people are working on different programming software. That's a real headache, and it adds to the administrative burden of passing things up the chain, so try and avoid that if possible. Another issue is where subcontractors might be on a JCT form and you're working on the NEC higher up the chain. The two don't work together, so try and avoid that if possible, particularly on programs, because you haven't got that update, or if you try and write it in, it just doesn't work in quite the same way. Constant rejection by project managers is another bugbear we see all too often. Sometimes that's one issue that's quite a minor issue, and maybe just needs to be nipped in the bud quickly. Everyone needs to get around the table and talk about it, and it gets resolved. Sometimes that just doesn't happen. It could be an initially sensible reason, positions harden, and you end up with this snowballing effect, and that can be compounded if at the same time you've got delays to the programs and the subcontractors aren't feeding in, so it all builds up. Very occasionally, and unfortunately I have seen this, is there's almost a deliberate, I'm going to reject this accepted program because I want myself to assess the CE, and I can do that easier or to my own favouring myself if there isn't an accepted program. That is not NEC behaviour. It's going to lead to worse problems. It's going to be a recipe for dispute in practice. So if people start seeing that behaviour, you should have massive warning flags. And the employer should stamp on their project manager at that point, because it is not in the interest of the job, and it's going to discourage you from believing in the programme. But unfortunately, we do see that all too often. Failure to show key information, i.e. dates, design has to be ready by dates, clients have to provide equipment, information, etc. If it's not on the programme, you're reducing your chances of getting a CE for it, an extension of time, because it's not there. But people are working to this. It's meant to be a working project management tool, so it's thinking about that in advance and making sure that information is there. And then again, accepted programs that haven't dealt with CEs or potential CEs in them, where there are issues and people know about the issues because they're worried about results. Again, it's difficult and it goes against instincts, but you should be showing what is happening, even if you haven't got the accepted CE yet, because it's about trust in the job, and you can't build this thing. Ultimately, it's meant to be a working tool if you don't have trust in the programme and people can't rely on it. So from our perspective, and I know Scott's going to cover this from a programming perspective, try and stick to contractual deadlines, because often if they slip even slightly, it sets off this chain of events that's detrimental to the job down the line. That often needs sufficient programming resource. Quite often we're told that people have left and there isn't a programmer, and or they only work a certain amount of time. You need to buy into this process, and that means putting the resources in there at main contract level, but also at subcontract level. It has to be prioritised. It's a task that has to be done. Once you get into the swing of it, especially at the beginning, it will be easier if you've done the job right to start with. Help the subcontractors to help you by giving them the information they need to do their job and making it reliable. If everything's starting to get too difficult, get people around the table, explain what you've done, and try and start getting around those issues. The earlier you do that and nip it in the bud, the better. But from a practical perspective, if people keep on rejecting your programs, but you think they're good, you think they're accurate, and you're happy with them, continue submitting them, even if they aren't accepted. Don't get disheartened. It will save you a lot of money at the end of the job if you end up in a final account fund fight, if you've already got those programs there. If you've got accurate update information and you're happy that the as-built data in there, it will save you an absolute fortune. But also it means you're on the front foot. People will know that when it comes to trying to settle it if you have got a dispute. Obviously, it's good contemporaneous evidence if they're accurate, and that's a big if. So make sure that they are accurate and they reflect what is actually going on the ground. Use the tools in the contract to push the project manager if they don't do their job and respond to the requisite timescales. That is their job, they should be doing it. And the reason the deeming acceptance is in the NEC 4 is it was such a problem in the NEC 3. So have a look at the flow diagram we put earlier in the slides and use that and think about it and use it as a tool. If that isn't working, then you need to start thinking about escalation. And too often people think about escalation too late down the line. At the beginning of the job, it is the last thing you want to do is just sort of crystallizing a dispute or talking about escalation or getting it resolved. But if you have got round the table and you've got difficult people, maybe one person who's blocking something and it's just not happening and you need that accepted programme, then seriously think about using the tools in the contract for escalation. And that means senior representatives meetings, or if it's really important and you know that this is going to be a massive problem and you've got warning signs, it's a difficult decision for commercially, but think about adjudication, because if you can get that accepted programme accepted, you've got the baseline and it may nip a lot of bigger issues in the bud. Obviously, that's a big call, especially at the beginning of the job, but something to think about. So I'm going to hand over to Scott for a sort of more of a programming take on these issues.
Thank you, Claire. Very similar. It's just, keep going with updating the programs and don't lose heart with the process. It is really important that the program updates are accurate and that you've got supporting evidence for that. Not only so that you can, at the time, demonstrate that the program's reasonable and is a tool to manage this project, but as Claire said, it will save you a lot of heartache in the future if you do need to go back and explain your position and show how delays built up over time. One of the worst things that can happen in NEC, and it happens a lot, unfortunately, is the whole sequence gets out of sequence. So you're ending up, looking, well, which program do we use to try and understand the impacts of this CE? And there's a lot of games that can be played in trying to sort of disrupt that process. So it is really important that you resource up for it and you get your foot ahead and keep going. It's just, it just can't be underestimated how important the program is in the NEC. And back to you, Claire.
So past the point of no return, by which I mean you're at the end of the job and you're essentially in a JCT style final account process, which obviously shouldn't be happening under the NEC in the first place, so you're in a bad position that does. Common debates we see, prospective versus retrospective analysis of time. So obviously the NEC is meant to be forward-looking. You're meant to be forecasting what the effect of your CE is going to be, and that is meant to be resolved ideally before the works are even done, so that it is a theoretical assessment. If you're at the end of the job and say you've got a lot of CEs that haven't been accepted or the quotations are in dispute, but you know how long those activities actually took, then a retrospective analysis is something you should think about, especially if your forecasting wasn't very good at the time and you've got a very big discrepancy between, I think it's going to take X and it's actually taken that long. That's not going to be very convincing to any adjudicator, certainly not in my experience. So you need to be doing a sort of reality check at the end of the job. You can't just say, oh, well, NEC's prospective, here's my massive forecast for something that actually took this long. In our experience, it's just not gonna wash. Are accurate contemporaneous programs available? If they are, big tick, you're going to save a lot of money. Very useful. You need to check the progress data in them is reliable. Too often people say, yeah, that's fine, but you actually get down to it. The ASBOT data is not 100% accurate. You need to check that and verify it. What other records have you got to do that? Just relying on the program is never a good idea. You always need to check that your program reflects common sense and what actually took place on the job. Having a theoretical whizzy program analysis, and then you go, actually, there's a document here that says that didn't happen on that date. That throws your entire analysis out the window. Is nobody's interest. It's just time consuming and it costs money. So it is, the other lesson is, it is always more time consuming and expensive to analyse an extension of time entitlement at the end of the job, especially where it's not just one, it's like lots of Cs that haven't been agreed and it's a big mess. Memories are not as fresh, staff leave and records are lost. People sometimes throw them away. So keep that in mind when you're going through the job. However hard the accepted programme process must be, really try and push forward as best you can, and we realise that sometimes it's just not possible. Resolving those issues and getting on top of them really quickly, because people are more willing to do that while issues are still fresh, and it's easier to do it. And also you're prospectively analysing it, and that could wake up as a good thing or a bad thing. It depends what your analysis says compared to reality, but push it forward and try and keep on top of it, because it is more expensive to do it at the end of the job. So Scott.
Yes, and a bit of sort of war stories here in terms of, you know, how do you approach it in the real world? Definitely one of the issues is, do you deal with each issue separately, or do you just throw it all in and sort of hope for the best? I think they both have advantages and disadvantages. I think if you're at the end of the project, you probably would put everything together, because it's going to be much harder to explain that you've done a legitimate explanation of one compensation event in isolation if you haven't also included what the rest of the issues that were seen on the project. And so how do you do that in an NEC related dispute? Well, yeah, you could do the compliant time impact analysis. So you're taking the program, the most appropriate program, whether it's, you know, the accepted program or an update, or if there wasn't an accepted program, an early program that you say was a reasonable one. But as Claire was saying, you know, if this is after the event, you actually know what happened on the project. So it would be high risk, I think, to only approach a dispute at the end of the job using a time impact analysis. At the very least, do a sense check. So look at whether your time impact analysis is showing anything close to what actually happened. If it does, then you've got a chance. Or you undertake a more fact-based analysis, you know, more traditional delay analysis, looking at how delay accrued over time. But does this run the risk of not being accepted? Now, I've seen adjudications where some adjudicators are very strong on keeping the NEC contract processes running, so they will only take the results of a time impact analysis. And I've seen the other end of the spectrum where they won't look at the time impact analysis. It's all about what actually happened. So yeah, belts and braces do both, but that's really expensive and takes a long time to prepare. So in an ideal world, don't let it get to this situation. But as Claire's already mentioned, that regardless of what's happening, records are absolutely key. And part of those records should be your planning statement, so you can explain how the program evolved over time. And I think it's back to you, Claire.
Yeah, and I just finishing off with this Northern Irish case, which I think is one of the, we don't have that many NEC cases generally, but just to refresh people's memories, Northern Ireland housing executive versus healthy buildings. It is Northern Irish, but it's still good guidance, and people are adopting it. And this is this quote, and it was a final account dispute at the end of the job. Why should I shut my eyes and grope in the dark when the material is available to show what work they actually did and how much it cost them? And applying that to program, it's just, if you're going on a very unrealistic prospective analysis that differs wildly to what actually happened, you are on a losing ticket, in our experience anyway, right from the beginning. So just keep that quote in mind if you are in the final account dispute process, because ultimately you've got a claim and you need to prove that on the balance of probabilities, and reality is always a good check for that. So with that, I think it's the candidates' questions.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. That clearly was a very practical guide to some of the issues. And unsurprisingly, we've had a number of questions, particularly right towards the end of the session. So apologies if we don't have time to consider them all. But most of them have centered around the concept of the accepted program, and what happens if the program isn't accepted within the preferred time period. What if the project manager gets it wrong, keeps rejecting your program? I suppose, what do you do if the program isn't accepted? Scott, I know we've talked about it to some degree, but I don't know if you've got any sort of further comments on that.
I think it's just keep going. I mean, keep the records, keep doing genuinely sensible and realistic updates to the program, because at some point those will become very important. I mean, hopefully the deadlock will be broken and you'll get an accepted program, but you still then need to have these updates so you can understand how the project developed over the time. So I would just, you know, believe in the process, keep the program a realistic tool. Don't try to play too many games and make it political to sort of meet your own ends, but keep it practical, realistic with supporting records.
Okay, thanks. And so without the accepted program, the project manager still needs to sort of carry out their own assessment. Is that right?
That's right. If there's no accepted program, then the project manager will have to do the impact assessments on using their own knowledge and experience of the project. So
Okay.
it still happens, but it's it's taken away slightly from the contractor.
Okay, no, thank you. And I think there's been some discussion of subcontractors. I mean, I think maybe perhaps one for you, Claire. How do you encourage the subcontractors to produce an accepted program?
It's a good question. I think first of all is checking that you have got those NEC mechanisms in place and that they understand what NEC involves. As you go further down the contractual chain, sometimes people are less familiar with the processes. And if you can get in there early and explain to them what you need and make that very clear, perhaps have a session with them to explain it, that helps. There's obviously the stick or potential stick of withholding monies. Maybe you could flow that further through the job. That's, might have pros and cons to doing that. But also, too many times on acting for subcontractors, you see that they just don't have the information available to make sure that their program can work. They don't have the width of the vision. They're not the main contractor. They don't know everything. So actually, a lot of the time, it's about making sure you want to keep what you're doing as the main contractor slightly sort of hidden in some ways, but actually, is that backfiring because you then don't have the tools you need to compile your program? So it's sort of chicken and egg, and I think people need to think about that a lot more right at the beginning of the job before things become political. Is everything realistic? Do they have enough information available?
And I suppose also enough time. I mean, programs do take a lot of time to put together and put right. And I think it's something that whatever contract you're working under, sort of people need to bear that in mind. Mark, I know I sort of highlighted you at the beginning for being sort of part of our project team. We've been sort of focusing on the actual specific clauses of the NEC form. Someone's been asking about whether you see many amendments or any amendments to the NEC contracts when it comes to dealing with the accepted program.
To be honest, you don't see that many amendments because I think it's generally accepted what contractors and subcontractors have to deliver with their NEC programs. What you do see is what I was mentioning before about specifying the type of programming software that a contractor's got to use and how that's got to be integrated. So it's more, how the information is being presented. If a client wants the program presented in a particular way, then it should be expressly stated. You could either do that through the scope or the works information, or you could add it as a Z clause.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to have to draw proceedings to a close now. As I've said, copies of the slides will be available on our website. I think Stacey's put a link in the chat, and shortly a copy of the webinar itself will be available too. So it just leaves me to thank Scott, Claire and Mark very much for your valuable insight and input, and just to note that our next webinar will be on Thursday the 23rd of June, when my colleagues Ed Foyle and Hugh Wilkins will be looking at expert evidence. You may have seen that there have been a number of decisions from the courts in the past few months, not all of them particularly favourable to experts, it has to be said, and Ed and Hugh will be sort of telling us more about the lessons that can be learned from the courts. So thank you all very much for your questions, thank you all very much for attending, and we'll see you all in June.